It is my joy to introduce Lori G. from Herman Miller next. She is the Vice President of Applied Insight at Herman Miller and basically translates the company's research into innovative and meaningfully different workplace solutions. She's a design practitioner with 30 years experience. She's driving workplace change and helping organizations catalyze their work environments. And what she's really interested in is pulling the science, neuroscience, into the kind of decision-making and innovations that we are all involved in. I'm really looking forward to it. She says she's not the science brain behind the research, but she's going to know more than most of us, I think. So, Lori, please, we're very excited.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here. I was going to try to convince Brian earlier to hum a few bars of Pharrell Williams' Happy Song just to get us in the mood for what we were going to do. But I thought he had a lot going on, and he maybe didn't have a chance to practice that. So I'd like to actually start with, well, he'll do it later. We all heard it at a cocktail hour. So what I thought we'd start with to set the tone is a brief little video. So we will have our friends in the back get this started for us. Okay, so maybe a little exaggerated and a little extreme, but does happiness really matter? Is it as obvious as living beats dying and we should just move on and we don't really need to talk about it? It's something that we think is pretty important, actually, and we know that it's been an elusive topic and a topic that people might think is more relevant to talk about with their therapist than to think about how it can be solved in the workplace. But we think, actually, what we just saw in that video is pretty symbolic of what we see in a lot of organizations. So Christy mentioned the importance of that leadership component, right? We were channeling not a very good leader with the Grim Reaper. We were seeing some things that the culture was affecting. We were seeing probably in that downer kind of organization that they hadn't put much attention on change management. A lot of things that we know are at play. So, and they had so much dysfunction as we looked at the sad environment that no one was really noticing the place. But what it comes through is it comes through in the people. And so what we want to always think about is, let me jump back here. Looks like I jumped a slide. Okay. I see I have a slide that I've misplaced. Anyway, okay. So I believe, as a group of practitioners with diverse backgrounds in this room, that we are accountable to helping draw out that happiness. And we do that by thinking about a very total look at human experience, akin to when we think about what happens in the development of digital tools, right? The total user experience, that very holistic view, is what gets thought about. When we think about what we all can do in the physical space, it has a lot to do with the experience that we're trying to create. So what we are thinking about on this diagram that I flashed here a second ago is very aligned with what Christy just talked about. The heart at the top is all about shared passion, shared vision, shared energy. It's about how do we actually draw that out and hold our spaces accountable to attending to that. But this is a dynamic equilibrium. We are also very hard at work in thinking about the community or the group. So that group of people on the right-hand side of the diagram is reminding us of what Christy just took us through in a very specific way. Now, we do all of this as part of a dynamic equilibrium, and we can't stop thinking about the individuals as represented by what is on the left side of the screen. The individuals are still important. We're still accountable to differentiating what their unique individual experience is as part of broader groups and community. And we do all of that while we're thinking about how we're good stewards of the money side of things, as represented with our little dollar sign at the bottom. So this is all important, and we think about this as achieving an idea of prosperity. What we know about what's happening in organizations is if you're going to go well into the future and be successful, that prosperity is a much more sustainable ambition and a more sustainable idea and an important idea to carry all of this off. So that becomes a really, really important aspect of what we're doing. Now, what we also know is that actually, when we attend to that human experience, think about this drive to prosperity, this is all pretty squishy stuff. So you've probably already said, what is she talking about? Where's the science part? It is squishy. And it has been very subjective, and I think the challenge for all of us is in the work we do, there haven't been good scientific methodologies to actually qualify what we're doing and make sense out of it all. So as we start to think about this, we're beginning to think about how do we go well past the fabulous pre-post surveys to test employee satisfaction, right? We've got to go past their opinions, past those surveys, to really get underneath it and make some sense out of it. And that's exactly what we're setting out to do, is to tie that in much more deeply. So I am, as Brian indicated, a designer by training. I have successfully navigated around having to take much science. I think I made it through my whole college career without having to take really any science to speak of. And I run from it to some levels. But I think what I'm getting excited about is there are some new opportunities to actually bring the art of what we all do around the workplace together with the science. And I think that's going to render some new things that we're all going to be able to do in a really, really solid way. So science is where we're trying to go. We're looking at moving it past the employee satisfaction surveys. And to do that, Herman Miller got connected with, through the Drucker Institute, Dr. Paul Zak. Dr. Paul Zak runs the Neuroeconomic Sciences Lab at Claremont University. And you see a picture of him here with a hypodermic noodle. I knew I was going to say it. Needle. Okay. Yeah, that science stuff. I really avoid it. Okay. So we see him here in one of his TED Talks where he is talking about the work his lab has been doing for a dozen years. And in that work, what they've been measuring and why there's a hypodermic needle there is they've actually been measuring the oxytocin levels in people's blood and understanding. And oxytocin, not Oxycontin, but oxytocin, is measured to understand our happiness, our mood, our trust. And we're going to look at some of the results that came through research that we did directly with him in a few minutes. But he has really advanced this. He's done this work with the military, with organizations. He's done it with tribes in various desolate areas of the world to really prove undoubtedly that there is a key tie, and our happiness affects a lot of the other things we do from a performance perspective. So what got our attention is in his body of work over a dozen or so years with his lab, he's already documented that when people are happier, you see a 19% increase in their productivity. When people are happier and working in groups, we've been seeing actually he's been seeing a 22% increase in their ability to innovate and do creative problem solving. We also know from his work that he's seen these high, happy in that quartile. They are ending up with 33% fewer sick days. And oh, by the way, they're 17% more satisfied at large with their life. So there are a lot of things that he's starting to get a touch on for us. And what that all means, if I distill it down to something that gets it beyond the soft and squishy aspects that I was initially talking about, is that's all leading to performance. And that's what we know people are striving for. That's what the people we all work for are looking for us to bring some greater detail in. So what we're working to do with Paul is, oops, I jumped ahead. I think we have, sorry about that. Okay. What we have seen in our work with Paul is that he's been working through his efforts with thousands and thousands of people on the three right-hand sides of this, this little logic train. And he's demonstrated with some of the statistics that I just gave you what those implications are on productivity and innovation. What we're trying to do with Paul is decode what the implications from workplace design are. And so what we're going to look at are some of the details that we got into with our research with him that starts to make some sense out of this. Now, I will tell you, this is the early stage of this research, but it is showing what we can begin to uncover about how the brain works. So, his work was aligning with a body of work that Herman Miller has had underway to understand unmet needs in activities that are happening in best practice organizations. So when we looked at those activities and worked to understand those, we've translated those activities from 35 that were uncovered in the broad base of research that was done around the globe down to 10 specific activities that we've then moved to the middle part of the diagram, and we've translated a way to be sensitive to those activities in settings that make a difference. And if you think of a setting as a spatial recipe that's going to yield the results you're hoping to with that activity, that's really what a setting is. So it's a spatial definition. And then we've taken that into when those settings are mixed together in a landscape, what does all of that mean? So we'll take a look at a few of those details. And I'm going to jump back here. I'm actually going to jump ahead a bit. So as we've gotten into studying the happiness that I'm going to speak to, again, we targeted our focus on the activities that are about co-creation and creativity among groups of 3 or 4 people. We chose that as our focus because we know that there are needs that haven't been met around that aspect of work. And so as we focused on those small group cognition activities, hopefully we'll have power to get through, as we focus on those small group cognition activities, we were looking to really understand some of those specific dynamics. And that gave us a good degree of focus that we would conduct in our efforts. Now, the other thing I will tell you, we actually looked at 3 different setting types. So if we go back to that colorful little box diagram, we looked at 3 different types of spaces, and we looked at spaces that were already pretty darn good based on everything we all know collectively and just intuitively know to do. So we could have slighted this research to say, we're going to start with, a 1950s barracks kind of area and have it be a really crude kind of space that would, of course, render a great contrast. Our ambition was, though, to get into a level of granularity so that we could help all of you with some new information on the things you need to pay attention to in those spaces. So in doing that, we actually had 5 of Paul's grad students descend on one of our facilities. So this was unproven, a brand new way to do this, so we did it to ourselves. And let me go through some of the details of what that research entailed. We actually involved 96 people. We had to recruit them and get them involved in this. And in true transparency, we had to tell them that we would be asking for 2 blood draws. We were going to put, as you see in the image, a chest monitor on them. In a minute, you'll see a little probe we put on their finger. And we were going to ask them some pretty specific and sensitive questions. And so it was a little bit tough recruiting folks to do this. The needle got a little scary for them right off the bat. But all of that was going to tell us biologically what was happening in their body as we were going through and they were doing some different very specific activities. So we controlled with what the activity is. So what we did in this effort was drew together 3 or 4, it ended up being 4 people in each of the groups. We drew them together, gave them an individual task that was basically a series of math questions that they were timed and they were judged for accuracy, all the kind of stuff to simulate the kinds of things our brains cycle through in the day. And then they were given a group problem to solve. These people didn't typically work together. They were given very few instructions. The thing they were solving, in true transparency, was they were going to assemble an apple peeler. How many of you have assembled an apple peeler with no instructions, right? So not something that anybody would have an up on and familiarity with. So what we were looking to do in actually studying that specific set of spaces with them is we were looking to understand their heart rate changes, the change to that oxytocin, as well as adrenocorticotrophin. Okay, I mentioned I'm not the scientist, but I have figured out how to say that word. Adrenocorticotrophin is the short response, and someone else in here will probably know this better than I, as to what's happening with stress in your body. It's a lot quicker response than the cortisol that we all know about. So we watched these people go through this, and they actually did these tasks. We measured a number of things before the task and after the task. I hope this isn't grossing anyone out, but it is the reality of it. That is one of our esteemed colleagues' arms. And so here are some of the findings. Again, early findings on 3 specific space types where people were doing this set of tasks. The setting types are what you see across the bottom. Probably not as important to know what those each are for today's purpose. But what we were looking for is, and this is the only subjective part of the data that we're going to share, this is actually talking about their immediate visceral reaction to the space. How did they rate the desirability of the space? The next thing we were looking to measure is actually understand what the mood was based on that blood draw, and see if there was correlation to their visceral reaction. And so one space rose above. Now these are all statistically significant numbers. There were terabytes of data that were amazingly deep and intensive. And so we see a little bit of a nudge up on one of the space types that we call a plaza, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of these different space types are. We actually saw, we saw some differences in the baseline stress hormone. The space in the middle ended up by, overall, it was the least desirable, and it ended up rendering the highest baseline stress level. Then we also looked at what the heart rate was, and that actually data lined up with what we learned from the blood draw in terms of what was being suggested on the monitor. And what this starts to net out to be, again, there's lots and lots of ways the data has been sliced, and there's a lot more data we need to collect for different areas. But this starts to be very telling. We actually saw the most preferred space, and the space that ended up with the best creative output ended up with a nice boost in trust and that mood side of things, a nice reduction, this is the far right bar, a nice reduction in the stress that was at play. And then we get into understanding what did that do to their ability to solve problems in that same space. And what we looked at is a 55% boost in the creative problem solving as folks were using that given space. So beginning data, beginning a methodology that gives us subjective, very specific kind of insights that we can start to apply as to why those changes occurred. And where will this all go? And why should we think about this? Well, we know that we feel before we think, and that our brains are already making a bunch of decisions before we get about doing our work. And so we know that we need to take those signals and think about when we've got, we're running out of tricks that we can do to space and to solve for employees. How can we take some of the ideas that have surfaced here and go further? So our efforts with Dr. Zach, and he got affectionately known as Dr. Zacula, because of what he came in to do, is how can we do some of these studies without blood draws? Because I bet all of you would have some difficulty recruiting folks to do that. How do we do some of this study with a broader array of settings and look at the compare and contrast? And how do we actually think about the interplay across a broader set of space and intermix between settings? So there's a number of different things that we're looking to do, but I think for the purposes of today, what we're asking you to think about is the space that gave us the best creativity output had the highest buzz as tested by the amount of light, the amount of movement, the amount of, and the amount of noise was the third thing. So as we think about some small group activities, we want to think about where they can happen that has that kind of sensory stimuli. Not all spaces should look as active and dynamic and have the buzz we're suggesting is here in this image, but you want to be selective and plan your overall space around that set of considerations. The other thing that we would suggest, and I'll just touch this briefly, I know we're moving here quickly, is there are a range of different small group problem-solving activities that happen. Be very deliberate and purposeful about how you solve for those. Again, that will help engage the brain in the best possible way. So we have a number of different needs that are being addressed in the 4 different spaces that you're seeing on the screen. But one of the things we also know is people's habits get locked in so quickly that you need to help people understand some of the different spaces that have been set up in your change management processes. We're encouraging, as you go forward, think about leading with solving for happiness. Think about how you do that in creating a vibrant city of ideas. We know organizations who win are the organizations who can move ideas through most quickly, and engage those brains in the most optimal way by thinking about things in as holistic a way as possible. So the brain's going to decide if they're happy or not. And I think it's up to us to push the performance by basing it on the effectiveness that we're instilling in some of these spaces by these early learning. So we'll look forward to sharing the added research as more of it unfolds.
Wow, that is great. Thank you, Laura. I know I have a lot of questions, but it's really about you. So does anybody have a question? Yes, Mark, can you shout it out so I don't have to run back there?
What we're learning, and we have some other work underway around that, is we have to actually nudge and help them with that. As much as we're working to make spaces as intuitive as possible, we're finding that there still need to be some permissions granted and some old mental models that need to be shifted. So we are seeing it's not completely self-evident.
Next question. Okay, Peter.
Hi, Peter Miskovich. We found that with clients, you can provide socialization space, and your data sets are a bit inconclusive if I really look at the data. But if leadership and management doesn't engage in those spaces and provide, lead by example, regardless of the happiness quotient or the compensation, to the earlier presentation, they may not be effective. Have you examined that influencing factor?
Yeah, what we have, and it's not as scientific as some of this data, but what we have seen is when leaders are invested all the way through and lead by example, you get the best uptake. So we didn't specifically look at that in this study, but it is absolutely what we're seeing as a pattern. So absolutely.
Hi, I'm Susan Spielman with Pivot Interiors. Can you talk a little bit, Lori, about change management? Like you were showing the 4 different conference room settings, and I find even with clients that it's difficult for me to articulate what that actually means.
Yeah, that's a good thing. What we're seeing, and this actually is something that we've seen done really well in a higher ed, is as new students come on campus and are starting their programs, a lot of higher ed institutions are educating or informing, helping students understand their unique learning styles and where their preferences are. And in doing that, they're also helping them develop strategies as to how to capitalize and use the variety of things that are on campus for them. We're likening some of that kind of startup where having people have that self-awareness and understanding some of that by themselves so that they can curate their day to make it most optimal for them is something we've got to help fill the gap. And it takes some reinforcing because we all fall back into old habits really quickly. But if we can help people understand kind of how they're wired a little bit more deeply and then fulfill on that in the change management steps, it's a big help.
I think we just have time for one more question. So, Jim, I saw your hand go up.
A little less a question than an observation and story. I think part of what's going on is that we all of us, not just in this room, but across the economy and society, are learning to rethink what it means to work. Work is now much more about conversation and about problem solving and meetings than it used to be. And so work settings, most of us have associated in our mind what a work setting is.
Right.
And much of what you're showing doesn't look like a typical work setting.
Right.
My quick story is a company which shall remain unnamed that I know put a very attractive coffee bar right behind the reception area in the corporate headquarters building, and nobody used it for 2 or 3 months until the senior executives started holding meetings there. Right. So it's back to your
Right.
story
Right.
about leadership.
It's huge. That's a big, big component of it. So
It's great. Well, Lori, thank you so much.
All right.
I'm sure there's a lot more coming.
there is.